The unexpected rescue. The war had been going on for months. Humanity was locked in a brutal struggle with a fierce alien species that seemed almost unbeatable. The enemy had advanced too far, too quickly, and humans were forced to retreat into small, hidden pockets of resistance. The city was in ruins, buildings crumbling under the weight of war. Smoke filled the air, and every corner was dangerous. Soldiers moved carefully, never knowing when an enemy might strike. In the midst of this destruction, one soldier, named Jack, was on patrol, checking the perimeter of a small hidden base. He had seen death before, but there was something different about today. There was an eerie silence, a sense that something wasn't quite right. Jack moved through the broken streets, his boots crunching on the rubble as he looked around, staying alert for any movement. Suddenly, a soft sound reached his ears, a quiet, almost desperate noise. Jack froze, listening closely. It sounded like crying. He glanced around, his rifle ready in his hands. The noise came from a nearby alleyway, and without thinking, he slowly moved toward it. His heart began to race. Who could be hiding there? Was it a trap? As he approached the alley, Jack's eyes caught something unusual. At first, he thought it was a trick of the light, but as he stepped closer, he saw them clearly. Two figures huddled together in the shadows. A mother and her daughter, both alien, trembling with fear. The mother was tall and thin, her skin a strange shade of violet, with sharp pointed features. The daughter, smaller and younger, had bright eyes filled with terror. They looked like they had been hiding for days, their clothes torn and dirty. Jack's heart clenched. He had fought the aliens on the battlefield, but he had never seen one in this kind of situation before. They were always enemies, always attacking, always ruthless. But these two were different. They were scared, lost, and in need of help. Without thinking, Jack lowered his rifle and knelt down, keeping his distance. "It's okay," he said softly, though his words were in English, and he wasn't sure if they would understand. "I'm not here to hurt you." The mother alien looked at him with wide, wary eyes, her body stiff with fear. The daughter, clinging to her mother's side, peered out from behind her, her eyes full of both curiosity and fear. Jack tried again, speaking slowly, in the simplest way he knew how. "You're safe now. I'll protect you." The mother seemed to understand the tone of his voice. She took a cautious step forward, her eyes never leaving him. There was something in her gaze, a mixture of disbelief and hope. For the first time, in what seemed like forever, someone had reached out to them, not to kill them, but to help. Jack's heart softened as he realized that they were just as scared as anyone else caught in the chaos of this war. "We need to get you out of here," Jack said, standing up and offering his hand. "It's not safe. Follow me." The mother hesitated, glancing at her daughter, who had started to step closer. She seemed to be making up her mind, deciding whether or not she could trust him. Jack could see the fear in her eyes, but there was also something else, something that made him believe she would take a chance on him. Finally, the mother reached out, taking his hand. Her grip was firm, but there was a gentleness to it. Jack helped her up, then reached down to offer his hand to the little girl. The girl hesitated for a moment, looking at Jack's hand, and then slowly, with a shy but trusting look, she took it. They'd moved together through the war-torn streets, Jack leading them to a nearby safe house. It wasn't much, just a small, abandoned building, but it was hidden and secure, a place where they could rest for a while. As they walked, Jack kept his eyes constantly scanning the area. The enemy was still out there, and they were vulnerable. Every second was a risk. Once inside the safe house, Jack quickly checked the surroundings, making sure they were safe. He didn't have much food or water, but he offered what little he had to the mother and daughter. The mother took the water gratefully, her hands shaking slightly as she drank. The little girl watched Jack closely, her eyes never leaving him. She seemed to be studying him, her expression curious, as if she was trying to figure out who this human was. Jack took a seat across from them, his rifle resting beside him. He was exhausted, both physically and mentally, but he couldn't let his guard down. The war was far from over, and there was always the possibility that the enemy could find them. Yet, in this small moment, there was something else, a sense of peace. For the first time in a long while, Jack felt a connection, a strange bond with these two aliens who had become more than just victims of the war. They were people. They were survivors. The mother and daughter sat quietly, their eyes watching Jack, as if they had so many questions but didn't know how to ask. Jack didn't know how to answer them, but he understood something important. They were not his enemies. They were in this together now. Little did Jack know, this would be the beginning of a journey that would change his life forever. A new kind of family. The days passed in a blur, each one blending into the next. Jack kept his eyes on the horizon, always alert, but he also couldn't help but notice the subtle shift in the atmosphere around him. The alien mother and daughter, whom he had saved from certain death, had begun to change. They no longer just followed him like strangers. Now they were starting to rely on him. And it wasn't just for protection. There was something deeper, something Jack couldn't quite understand yet. The mother, whom Jack had learned was named Jara, seemed to watch him constantly. Every movement he made, every word he spoke, was observed with an intensity that made Jack feel as though he was under a microscope. She had started to trust him more, and though she never spoke his language, there was a silent understanding between them. Her face, usually so stiff with worry and caution, had softened, as though the weight of her fear had lightened just a little bit in his presence. The daughter, named Lyra, was even more intriguing. The little alien girl, no older than 8 by human standards, had begun to follow Jack everywhere. She watched him with wide, curious eyes, mimicking his every movement. When Jack ate, she would sit beside him, trying to copy his actions. When he checked the perimeter of their small safe house, Lyra would be at his side, peering through the cracks in the walls with a seriousness beyond her years. Jack couldn't help but chuckle at the way Lyra tried to imitate him, even copying his stance when he stood guard, though she was far too small to be of any help. The sight of the little girl trying so hard to be like him, to follow his every move, stirred something in Jack's heart. He'd never had children of his own, and he didn't know if he ever would. But this girl, this tiny alien girl, was starting to feel like something more, like she was his responsibility now. One evening, after a long day of moving through the debris-filled streets, Jack sat down to rest. Jara and Lyra were beside him. The quiet hum of the safe house a stark contrast to the chaotic world outside. Jack took a deep breath and ran a hand through his short, messy hair. His thoughts kept returning to the same question. Why him? Why had he saved them? What made these two different from the other aliens he had fought on the front lines? His thoughts were interrupted when Lyra suddenly tugged at his sleeve. Startled, Jack turned to look at her. The little girl had a small piece of cloth in her hands, something she had found in the wreckage. It was old, worn, and dirty, but in her tiny hands, it looked like a treasure. She handed it to him with a shy smile, her eyes hopeful and expectant. Jack took the cloth carefully, noticing the small, intricate designs sewn into the fabric. It was alien in origin, something he'd never seen before. The patterns were foreign, but somehow they felt meaningful. He looked at Lyra, trying to figure out why she had given it to him. She didn't say a word, but her eyes spoke volumes. "Thank you," Jack said quietly, his voice thick with emotion he didn't understand. It was just a piece of cloth, but it felt like so much more. Lyra's eyes sparkled, and she giggled softly, as if pleased with his reaction. Jara watched the exchange with a knowing look in her eyes. She didn't speak, but there was something in the way she looked at Jack that made him feel both uncomfortable and strangely honored. It was as if she was entrusting him with more than just her life and her daughters. It was as if she was beginning to see him as something more, something that was beginning to feel like family. The idea of family was foreign to Jack. Back home, in the chaos of the war, There hadn't been time for anything but survival. He had no wife, no children. His family was the soldiers who fought beside him. And even then, it was a loose connection forged by battle and blood. But now, with Jara and Lyra, something had changed. They were no longer just aliens he had rescued. They were becoming something more. The next day, as Jack went to check their supplies, he found Jara standing in the doorway, watching him with an unreadable expression. The way she looked at him now was different from before. She didn't just see a soldier. She saw a protector, someone who had put his life on the line for her and her daughter. Her eyes were softer now, filled with gratitude and something else that Jack couldn't name. She stepped forward, her voice tentative, but clear. "You protect us," she said, her accent thick but understandable. Jack was taken aback. It was the first time she had spoken to him directly in a language he could understand. Her words felt like a burden and an honor all at once. I'm just trying to keep you safe," Jack replied, unsure of what to say. His mind raced as he tried to understand the meaning behind her words. Jara took another step closer. The silence stretched between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was as if something unsaid hung in the air, waiting for both of them to acknowledge it. Finally, Jara reached out, her hand trembling slightly as she placed it on his arm. It wasn't a gesture of command or need. It was one of thanks, of understanding. Jack didn't know what to make of it. He had no answers, no plans. All he knew was that these two, this mother and daughter, had somehow found a place in his heart that he didn't even know existed. They weren't just aliens anymore. They were a family. And Jack, well, for the first time in a long while, he wasn't sure what the future held, but he was willing to find out. Unspoken bonds. Days turned into weeks, and the world outside their small, hidden safe house grew ever more dangerous. The war raged on, but for Jack, Jara, and Lyra, life had taken on a strange new rhythm. The bonds between them were growing, but they were still hard to define. It wasn't just a soldier protecting two refugees. Something deeper was forming, something neither Jack nor the aliens had expected. Lyra's attachment to Jack had become even more pronounced. She followed him everywhere, when he checked their defenses, when he cleaned his rifle, and even when he simply sat to eat. At first, it had been curious glances, an occasional tug on his sleeve, but now it was a constant presence. Lyra was never far from him, always observing, always watching. It was as if she was trying to learn everything about him, even without words. Jack had never been around children, and he didn't know how to react to the way Lyra mimicked his actions. She would copy his movements, trying to stand as tall as him, holding her small toy weapon like it was real, and practicing the way he held his rifle. It made Jack smile, despite the weight of everything happening around them. One evening, as the sun set and painted the sky in shades of purple and orange, Jack sat on a small broken piece of wall near their safe house. His rifle was resting on his knee, and his eyes were scanning the horizon. He was tired in a way that didn't go away, no matter how much he rested. The war had taken everything from him, and yet, in the presence of these two aliens, he felt something stirring deep inside, something he hadn't felt in a long time. He heard a soft sound beside him, and turned to see Lyra sitting next to him, her wide eyes gazing up at him with an intensity that caught him off guard. She didn't speak, just sat quietly, her little fingers playing with the edge of his jacket. For a moment, Jack just watched her, trying to make sense of what was happening between them. "You're different, Lyra," Jack said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. The words surprised him, but they felt right. It was like he was saying what he had been thinking for a long time. She tilted her head, her large eyes blinking slowly as if considering his words. Then she reached out, gently placing her small hand on his. The simple touch caught Jack off guard. It wasn't the touch of someone seeking protection or someone scared. It was something else, something that made him feel both a deep responsibility and a warmth that was new to him. She looked at him with trust and hope, as if she had found something in him that she had been missing for so long. Jara, too, had begun to change. She no longer kept her distance, staying silent and reserved like she had in the beginning. Now she often sat with Jack, talking to him in her strange, melodic language. Though they couldn't understand each other completely, there was something in her tone, in the way she looked at him, that spoke volumes. Jack had learned to recognize the small gestures, the way her eyes softened when she looked at him, the way she smiled when he did something she found amusing, even the quiet way she helped when things needed to be done. The most unexpected change, though, was the way Jara had begun to look at Jack. There was gratitude in her gaze, but now there was something else, something unspoken, like a question waiting for an answer. She had started to lean on him, both emotionally and physically. The small moments, when she handed him a tool, when she offered him food, or when she simply sat next to him, had become a language of their own. Jack didn't know how to respond to it. He had always been a soldier, a man of action. He wasn't good at expressing feelings, especially not with someone who was so different from him. But as time went on, he found himself letting down his guard around Jara. She was not just the alien he had saved. She was a woman, someone who had seen the worst of the universe and still found the strength to keep going. In a way, Jack understood that. They were both survivors. One night, as Jack sat by the small campfire they had made outside the safe house, Jara approached him. She was holding something small in her hands. Another gift. This time, it wasn't a piece of cloth, but something more personal. It was a necklace, a simple piece of jewelry made from alien materials that Jack didn't recognize. It was beautiful, delicate, with a small, glowing gem in the center. Without a word, Jara handed it to him. The gesture was quiet but filled with meaning. She had no words to say, but the act of giving him the necklace spoke louder than anything else. Jack took the necklace carefully, his fingers brushing against hers. He looked into her eyes and saw the same trust, the same bond that had been building between them. "Thank you," Jack said softly, his voice rough with emotion. He didn't know what else to say. He had never been good with words, but somehow she understood. Jara's eyes held something that Jack couldn't place, a warmth, a longing, a connection that was more than just survival. For a moment, there was silence between them, and it felt like the entire world had paused. The alien mother and daughter, who had once been strangers, were now more than that. They were family, in a way that transcended words, a bond that didn't need explanation. They weren't just survivors in a broken world. They were something else. They were beginning to heal together. Lyra's voice broke the silence as she tugged at Jack's sleeve once again. She looked up at him, her eyes full of affection and something else, something that made Jack's heart ache with a strange, unexplainable emotion. "Daddy," Lyra asked in her soft, alien voice. The word hit Jack like a bolt of lightning. He looked at her, stunned, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. Lyra wasn't just copying him anymore. She wasn't just seeking protection. She had said the word daddy, a word that meant something completely different to her. But it was clear to Jack that she had begun to see him in a way he hadn't expected. She saw him as more than just the man who saved them. She saw him as someone who would always be there for her. Jack swallowed hard, not knowing how to answer. But somehow, deep inside, he knew that his life, and theirs, had already changed forever. The mysterious connection. The nights were becoming colder, and the wind had started to carry a hint of something more dangerous. Winter was fast approaching, but the coldness outside couldn't touch the strange warmth that had begun to settle between Jack, Jara, and Lyra. Despite the chaos of the war, despite the fear that never seemed to leave them, there was a quiet peace here in this small, makeshift home they had made for themselves. It was a peace that Jack had never thought possible, especially with two aliens by his side. Lyra, still glued to his every move, had started to change too. Her once shy, nervous demeanor had shifted into something much more open, and her attachment to him was becoming undeniable. She would wake up in the middle of the night and find her way to his side, curling up on the floor next to him, as though it was the most natural thing in the world. She no longer looked at him with the curiosity of a child. Instead, she looked at him with something more profound, something that tugged at Jack's heart in ways he couldn't explain. Jara, too, had begun to display a quiet but unspoken dependence on Jack. She was still the strong, stoic mother, but she was no longer as distant. She no longer kept herself locked away emotionally. Instead, she had begun to let down the walls she had built up during the war. It was subtle at first, a glance that lingered a little longer, a slight softening of her expression when she looked at him. But as the days wore on, Jack started to notice how often she would seek his presence, as if his very existence gave her a sense of calm amid the chaos. It was late one evening when it finally happened. Jack had just returned from a scouting mission, checking the area for any signs of the enemy. The cold wind nipped at his skin, but his mind was preoccupied with something else. The thought that had been lingering in the back of his mind for weeks now was no longer easy to ignore. There was a growing bond between him and these two, one that was becoming harder to deny. When Jack returned to the safe house, he saw Jara sitting by the fire, her back turned to him. She was staring at something in her hands, something small, glowing faintly. Lyra, as usual, was sitting close by, her eyes wide, focused on Jack as he entered. "You're back early," Jara said softly, not turning to face him. Her voice was steady, but Jack could hear the faint tremor beneath it, a quiet tension that he didn't understand. "I wanted to be sure the area was clear," Jack replied, removing his gear and sitting down on the opposite side of the fire. He glanced at the glowing object in Jara's hands, which now caught the flickering light of the flames. It seemed almost alive, pulsating in a gentle rhythm, like a heartbeat. Jara held the object out to him, her gaze still not meeting his. "It's for you," she said simply. "A gift, for saving us." Jack was taken aback. He had received plenty of gifts in his life. Promotions, medals, the respect of his comrades. But this was different. This wasn't from a fellow soldier or from a country. This was from someone who had nothing to offer him, someone who had been on the run for their life. And yet, she was offering him something precious, something that seemed as though it had meaning beyond the simple gesture. Jara finally looked at him, her eyes filled with an emotion that Jack couldn't quite place. "I don't know what it is," she said, "but it's from our people. It's an ancient artifact. It holds meaning. And now, it is yours." Jack reached out carefully, taking the small object from her hands. It was smooth, cold to the touch, but it felt oddly comforting in his grip. The glowing light seemed to respond to him, shifting gently as if acknowledging his presence. The more he held it, the more a strange sense of peace washed over him. It was a feeling he couldn't explain, like the object had recognized him in some deep, unspoken way. "Thank you," Jack said quietly, his voice more sincere than he had intended. The weight of the moment hung between them, heavier than the war, heavier than any battle he had ever fought. This gift, whatever it was, wasn't just a token of gratitude. It was something much more profound, something that suggested that their bond was no longer simply that of protector and protected. It was something deeper, something that went beyond the roles they had assumed at the beginning of their time together. The night stretched on, and the fire crackled softly in the silence. Jack couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between them all. But before he could make sense of it, Lyra's soft voice broke the quiet. "Daddy?" she asked again, the word coming so naturally from her lips that it felt almost like a command. This time, Jack didn't flinch. Instead, he looked down at the little girl, who was looking up at him with complete trust in her eyes. She wasn't just mimicking what she had heard from Jara or repeating a word she had learned. No, there was a deep sense of meaning behind it. Lyra had begun to see him as something more than just a human who had saved her. She had started to see him as a father figure, someone who would always be there to protect her. Jack looked at Jara, who was now watching him closely, waiting for his reaction. Her gaze was unreadable, but there was a softness in it, a quiet understanding that spoke volumes. The connection between them had deepened, and it wasn't just in the words they shared or the gestures they made. It was in the way they had started to look at each other, not as survivors, but as something else entirely. "I'm not your real father, Lyra," Jack said softly, his voice thick with emotion. But as soon as the words left his mouth, he realized how wrong they sounded. Lyra smiled, her eyes full of innocent affection, and shook her head gently. She didn't need words. She didn't need to understand what real meant. To her, Jack was already her father in every way that mattered. Jara stood slowly and moved to his side, sitting beside him. For the first time, she placed her hand gently on his, her touch warm and steady. "Maybe it's not about what's real," she whispered. "Maybe it's about what we choose to make real." And in that moment, Jack realized that everything had changed. It wasn't about saving them anymore. It was about being there for them. For the long haul. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he wasn't fighting alone. They were fighting together. And whatever this was between them, it was something Jack wasn't ready to let go of. He had a family now. A shocking confession. The quiet bond that had been growing between Jack, Jara, and Lyra had begun to change the way they viewed the world. What had started as an act of survival had slowly turned into something else, a deep, unspoken connection that held them together like a lifeline in the middle of a storm. Jack never expected to find a family in the midst of war, especially one that wasn't even human. But there they were, relying on him just as much as he relied on them. But even in the peace of their small, secluded safe house, danger was never far away. The war didn't stop, and neither did the threats. The alien forces they had fought against for so long were relentless, and Jack knew that it was only a matter of time before they would have to leave the safety of their refuge and move again. As the days went on, the feeling of urgency grew. Jack started to sense that something was coming, a storm they wouldn't be able to avoid forever. And yet, every time he looked at Jara and Lyra, he felt a renewed sense of determination. They had become more than just the two aliens he had saved. They had become his reason for fighting. He wasn't just a soldier anymore. He was a protector, a father, a leader. He had something to fight for, something worth living for. One evening, after a tense day spent scanning the horizon for signs of enemy movement, Jack sat by the fire with Jara and Lyra. The shadows stretched long, and the night was growing colder, but Jack couldn't shake the feeling that something was different tonight. Jara had been quiet, more so than usual, and Lyra had barely spoken a word. There was a tension in the air, thick and heavy, and it wasn't just the uncertainty of their situation. Finally, after what felt like hours, Jara spoke, her voice low but steady. "Jack," she said, her gaze fixed on the flames. "There's something I need to tell you." The way she said his name, the weight in her tone, made Jack's heart skip a beat. He turned to look at her, but she didn't meet his eyes. Instead, she stared at the fire, as if the flames held the answers to something she had been carrying inside for far too long. Jack felt a knot tighten in his stomach. "What is it?" he asked gently, though his heart was racing. He could feel the shift in the air. Something was coming, something important. Jara took a deep breath, then finally met his gaze. Her violet eyes seemed to pierce right through him. "You are more to us than just a soldier, Jack," she began, her words soft, but heavy with meaning. "You saved us, yes. But now, it is not just about survival anymore." Jack felt a chill run down his spine. Her words hung in the air like a secret that was both beautiful and terrifying. He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could, Jara continued. We don't just see you as our protector. I've been thinking about this for a long time now, and I don't know how to say it. But it's something you should know." Jack's heart was thumping in his chest, his breath quickening. There was something in her eyes, something that told him this wasn't just a conversation about survival anymore. It was something deeper, something that, if he wasn't careful, could change everything. I see you as more," Jara whispered, her voice trembling ever so slightly. "Not just as a soldier, but as a man. As a part of this family. As something more than that." Jack didn't know what to say. He had never imagined that things would go this far. He had been raised to protect, to fight, and to survive, not to form emotional attachments, especially to aliens. But now, as Jara spoke, he realized how deeply this connection had already taken root, how much it had begun to shape who he was, what he had become. Jara looked away again, her expression conflicted. "I didn't want to say it, Jack. I didn't want to burden you with this. But Lyra," she stopped and looked at the little girl who had been quietly watching them both. Lyra's big eyes were filled with an emotion that Jack couldn't fully comprehend, but there was no mistaking it. Lyra wasn't just seeking protection from him anymore. She was looking to him for something more, something Jack wasn't sure he could give. Sarah's eyes darkened as she looked at him, and for the first time, he saw something more than just worry in her expression. There was fear. Fear not for herself, but for her daughter. She had already seen too much bloodshed, too much loss. Losing Lyra would break her in ways Jack wasn't sure she could survive. "We have to leave by dawn," Jara replied quietly. "If we stay here any longer, they'll find us. I can feel it." Jack stood up, his thoughts spinning. He knew what needed to be done. They couldn't stay here. The enemy would find them. It was just a matter of time. He looked at the fire, the flickering flames casting shadows on the walls of their hiding place. The feeling of impending doom hung in the air like a storm cloud, dark and heavy, ready to burst. "What about supplies?" Jack asked. "Do we have enough to get us through the next few days?" "We'll have enough if we move fast," Jara answered, already gathering what little they had left. "But it won't be easy. We'll need to travel light. The more we carry, the slower we'll be." Jack's mind raced. They had to move. But leaving the safety of the safe house meant facing the dangers of the outside world once more. The city was crawling with alien soldiers. The forests around them were filled with predators, both human and alien. The road ahead would be dangerous, and Jack knew that with every step they took, they were drawing closer to a line they might not be able to cross back from. It wasn't just the threat of enemies that had Jack on edge. It was the thought of what would happen if they got caught, if they were separated. As if reading his mind, Jara stepped closer to him, her voice low. "Jack, if we get caught." "We won't," Jack cut her off firmly. But even as he said the words, he wasn't sure if he believed them. Jara nodded, though she didn't look convinced. She understood the stakes just as well as he did. But this wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about family. And Jack had learned something important in the weeks they had been together. He wasn't going to let anything separate them. He couldn't. "I'll get us through this, Jara," Jack said, his voice steady, even though doubt gnawed at him from the inside. "I promise. We just have to stick together." But deep down, he knew that promises didn't always survive in the face of reality. The war wasn't something they could outrun, and Jack wasn't sure how long they could keep playing this game of hide and seek. Every choice they made was another step closer to an inevitable confrontation. The next morning, before the first light of dawn broke through the sky, they were ready. Jack had packed their few supplies and checked their weapons one last time. Jara had made sure Lyra was ready to travel, though Jack could see the worry in her eyes. Lyra had clung to Jack the entire night, not saying a word, her tiny hands gripping his sleeve with a desperation that spoke louder than any words could. "Jack," Jara said quietly as they moved toward the exit, her hand resting lightly on his arm. "If we get separated." "We won't," Jack repeated, though this time his voice held a different kind of certainty. "I won't let that happen. You're my responsibility, both of you." Jara's eyes softened at his words. There was no need to say more. She didn't need promises anymore, just actions. The moment they stepped outside, the cold wind hit them like a wall. It was early, too early for anyone to be awake, and the world was still, almost peaceful. But Jack knew better. The calm was just the eye of the storm. As they made their way through the debris of the ruined city, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that they were being washed. The streets were eerily quiet, too quiet. Jack's instincts kicked in, his eyes darting from shadow to shadow, scanning the rooftops, the alleyways, every corner. He knew the enemy was out there, and the longer they stayed in the open, the more vulnerable they became. Just as they rounded a corner, Jack caught a movement out of the corner of his eye. His heart skipped a beat. A small group of alien soldiers appeared from the shadows, weapons raised, blocking their path. "Stay behind me," Jack whispered urgently to Jara and Lyra, his voice low but filled with authority. He had seen this before. This was no accident. They were being cornered. Jara didn't hesitate. Her hand tightened on her own weapon as she took a protective stance in front of Lyra. The alien soldiers were closing in. Jack's mind raced. There was no room to fight, no place to hide. This was the moment, and if they didn't move fast, they would be caught. He had one choice, and it would take everything in him to make it. "Run," he whispered, eyes locked on Jara's. Now. Without hesitation, they bolted. The world around them exploded into chaos, but Jack's focus never wavered. He would keep them safe, no matter the cost. But the enemy was closing in fast, and the chance to escape was slipping away with every passing second. He couldn't lose them now. He couldn't lose his family. The chase had begun. A new family. The chase was relentless. Jack's breath came in ragged gasps as he sprinted ahead, his heart pounding against his chest. Behind him, he could hear Jara and Lyra, their footsteps quick and urgent. But Jack knew they were slowing down. The alien soldiers were closing in, too close for comfort. And they were out of time. They couldn't outrun them for much longer, not without a plan, not without something that could give them a fighting chance. Jack's mind raced as he scanned the surroundings. The streets were narrow, filled with debris and broken buildings, but it was no longer about finding a hiding place. They needed to get out of the open and into the cover of the nearby forest. It wasn't ideal. There were enemies in those woods too, but it was their best option. The trees would give them cover, and Jack knew that he could use the environment to his advantage if they could make it. "Jara," Jack called out, not slowing down. "Head for the trees. Move." Jara's voice called back, urgent but calm, as always. "Go. We're right behind you." Jack could feel the pull of Lyra behind him, the girl's small hands clinging to the back of his jacket, keeping pace as best as she could. She had no idea of the danger surrounding them. She was still too innocent to truly grasp the threat of what was happening. Jack tried not to think about the pain of leaving her behind, of the possibility that he might not be able to protect them this time. But his mind forced him to focus only on the task at hand: survival. They reached the edge of the city, where the buildings began to thin out, and the first trees of the forest loomed like sentinels in the distance. The sound of alien boots grew louder, and Jack's heart sank as he realized they were getting too close. He was running out of time. There was no more hiding. In a split second, Jack made the decision. He pivoted sharply to the right, pushing Jara and Lyra off the main path toward a narrow alley that led into a dense thicket of underbrush. He turned to face them, urgency in his eyes. "Get in there. Now," he barked, forcing them into the dense woods, hoping they'd have a moment of cover. Lyra stumbled but was quickly caught by Jara, who pulled her close. Jack had no time to make sure they were safely hidden. He had to buy them time. He glanced back. The soldiers were still coming, their alien voices ringing through the air, orders shouted to each other. There was a fire in Jack's gut, an animalistic drive to protect his new family. He picked up a discarded piece of metal from the street, something jagged and sharp, and prepared himself to hold his ground. This wasn't going to be easy, but there was no other option. "I'll hold them off," Jack said, looking at Shara one last time. "Stay hidden." Shara hesitated, her eyes wide with fear and concern, but she didn't argue. Instead, she nodded and pulled Lyra deeper into the underbrush. "Hurry back to us," she said softly, the words both a plea and a command. Jack swallowed hard, his pulse thundering in his ears. He could feel the pressure of the situation, the lives of the only people who had ever truly trusted him on the line, but there was no turning back now. With one last glance at the spot where he had left Shara and Lyra, Jack turned to face the incoming soldiers. They were getting closer, their footsteps crunching loudly against the debris-strewn streets. Jack's hand tightened around the jagged metal, and he crouched low, ready to strike. He wouldn't let them take his family, not without a fight. Suddenly, a voice echoed from the front lines of the alien squad. "Capture him. Don't kill him. We need information." Jack's heart skipped a beat. Capture him. The alien forces had always fought to destroy, not to take prisoners. Something was off. But Jack had no time to consider why. He heard the soldiers closing in, their weapons drawn. A sudden crash from behind him made him turn just in time. A heavy blast of alien fire zipped past his face, narrowly missing him as he dodged to the side. They were upon him. He threw the piece of metal toward one of the soldiers, knocking him back just enough to cause confusion in their ranks. It wasn't much, but it gave Jack enough time to dive into a nearby alley and disappear into the shadows. The alien forces were fast, but Jack knew how to move quietly in the dark. He had to stay one step ahead if he was going to survive this. He heard shouts from the soldiers as they spread out, searching for him. Jack kept his breathing shallow, waiting for the right moment. His muscles burned, but he held still, staying hidden. The sounds of the soldiers' movements became more distant, and Jack knew he had to move quickly. In one swift motion, he leaped from his hiding spot and darted toward the trees, where Shara and Lyra were waiting. They hadn't moved, still concealed behind thick brush, eyes wide with fear. Jack's heart caught in his throat as he reached them. "We need to move. Now." Shara grabbed Lyra's hand, and the three of them took off into the deeper forest, their footsteps quick and light, though Jack knew the soldiers would soon realize they'd been missiled. They couldn't stay in one place for long. As they ran deeper into the woods, Jack's mind raced with the possibilities. The alien soldiers weren't the only threat here. The forest itself was dangerous, filled with creatures that lurked in the shadows, waiting to prey on anything that moved. But for now, it was their only chance. The thick trees would make it harder for their enemies to follow them. Minutes turned into hours as they moved deeper into the wilderness. Jack kept a steady pace, keeping his senses sharp. There was no way of knowing if they were being followed, but the further they went, the more Jack felt the weight of their escape. The quiet of the forest was almost peaceful, but it couldn't fool him. They were far from safe. Finally, as the moon began to rise, Jack found a small, hidden clearing. It was tucked away, barely visible even from a short distance. He turned to Shara and Lyra, who were breathing heavily but looking at him with trust in their eyes. Jack sank to his knees, exhaustion catching up to him. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The look in their eyes said it all. They were together. They had survived for now. And they would keep surviving. Shara knelt beside him, her voice soft but filled with quiet strength. "Thank you." Jack met her gaze, feeling a strange calm wash over him. "You don't have to thank me. We're a family now, and I'll do whatever it takes to keep us together." In that moment, Jack realized something that went beyond the fight for survival. It wasn't just about keeping them safe anymore. It wasn't about keeping the enemy at bay or running from danger. It was about something deeper. It was about belonging, about love. The war wasn't over. They still had a long way to go, and the dangers weren't over. But for the first time in months, Jack felt something he hadn't felt in so long. Hope. They had each other. And that was enough to keep fighting. Jack stood up, ready to face whatever came next, because now he wasn't just fighting for survival. He was fighting for his family.